Welcome, everyone. Please find a seat. Welcome, everyone. I'm Peter Wanders. I'm the president and CEO of Anderson Ranch, and I'm really excited to have you all here for our final lecture of the summer speaker series. It's been a really great summer, and I cannot thank you enough. I'd really love quickly to thank Ann Cook, who's in the room, who chairs our Artisan Advisory Committee, and the staff who have really helped put this together, so thank you. I want to thank our presenting sponsor, Toby Devin Lewis, who's really helped make this program possible over the last few years and continues to give us very significant support to make these programs free and open to the public and really bring in great speakers, so thank you for that. Ulight Arts is one of our premier sponsors for this program. I've lost sight of Dennis, but he's here somewhere, but thank you for that support. And then a lot of individuals, our trustees and our national council members, step up to be annual supporters of the Summer Speaker Series. So I really thank you. If I listed them all, we'd never get to Larry, but their names are on the outside near the door. But please look at it and thank them when you bump into them. It means a lot for them to hear that you appreciate what they do as much as we do as the staff. Douglas Elliman Real Estate is a sponsor for us throughout the summer and really helps bring a lot of fun and interesting programs to the ranch. Christie's Auction House and Cultured Magazine are also both corporate and media sponsors that we really appreciate. So thank you to all of them. We're here to hear Larry Pittman speak, and we are excited to have Larry join us today. He got both his BFA and his MFA from California Institute of the Arts in Valencia, and since 1993, he's held the position of Professor of Fine Arts at the University of California, Los Angeles. He has a major solo exhibition probably being hung as we speak. It opens in September, called Larry Pittman, Declaration of Independence. It's at the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles, so I encourage you all to make it out there this autumn and see that show. His work has been the subject of numerous solo exhibitions, the Huntington Library, Museum of Contemporary Art St. Louis, the Consortium in France, Institute of Contemporary Art London. I got to turn my notes so I can keep reading. Los Angeles Museum of Contemporary Art Museum of Houston, probably all of your hometowns. So really had a great representation of these events, so I'll stop reading that list, but I'm really excited about all the great exhibitions you've had. He's won numerous medals. To name two of them, the Skowhegan Medal. He's had 3 fellowships in the National Endowment for the Arts. Again, really a great honor to have him here. His works are in the permanent collection of the Art Institute of Chicago, Harvard Art Museum, Los Angeles County Museum of Art, Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, Museum of Contemporary Art Los Angeles, Museum of Modern Art New York, San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the Hammer, the Whitney. Just really an amazing career and amazing art in those collections. So Larry, we're excited to have you here. I won't talk any more about your art because we will let you do that, but welcome. Please join me in welcoming Larry.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for coming. I'll just get right into it, okay? I won't go down memory lane. What I'll be showing is kind of a very edited version of work of the last 5 years. So, maybe some of you know some of the trajectory of the practice. Some of you might have it in your homes or know of it or have seen other shows in different cities. But I thought I'd just concentrate on the eve of a 40-year retrospective that I'm having at the Hammer Museum, which will then travel to Europe afterwards. I just decided to concentrate on the very newest production of the last 5 years. So here we go. And then we'll open it up for questions afterwards. I've always worked in series, kind of large, overarching conjectural ideas. I think my practice remains to this day deeply analog and fundamentally conjectural. It might intersect with ideas of some topicalities, but it really comes out of my personal lens of obsession with human nature. And that's how I make the bodies of work. At CalArts, it was an incredible education. So a lot of my prep work is done sitting at my desk, writing sentences, the narrative, setting up the premises for a body of work. I never take for granted and never have taken for granted the privilege of exhibiting my work over these last many years. So my reality, which I realize is a very privileged one, is that my production for the last 40 years has been fundamentally connected to the act of exhibition. So that's why I think that structure, that structure of making a body of work with the act of its imminent exhibition has as much shaped the practice as well. So I'm a traditional studio artist. I still work alone, and it's not some sort of ideological position. I think of all the practices that fares the worst when done by committee is painting. I think, of course, but at the same time, I think there are practices that need that consortium of people to get things done. So it is, no surprise that a great artist, like, for example, Jeff Koons, who I adore his sculpture, possibly makes the worst paintings because they're done by a consortium. So I think that's the one thing that I always look at, is that painting still is fair best. And one of the things I always tell visitors to my studio, part of the reason I have that position of working alone and in an analog format by myself is that I don't do pret-a-porter. It's not a factory. I'm prolific, I'm hardworking, and remain ambitious. But it's not pret-a-porter at the same time. It's couture. So here we go. So this is a project I did that I showed with Regan Projects in Los Angeles, who I've worked with for, I don't know, Isha, maybe, 20 years? And this is a body of work, again, a conjectural idea of a fictitious late Western imperium, and to look at what such a late Western imperium might produce as their artifacts and their paintings. So I've always nominated ideas of both association and disassociation, where the project that I assign myself to do has to do with creating work that the premise makes, not necessarily me. So it's the conceptual premise is actually making the work. So this is a body of work that I've always worked in small format works on paper, as well as what I call, spectacle painting, in the sense that many people can stand in front of the painting and enjoy it simultaneously, or drawings, which I dearly love as well on paper, which is more exacerbating in a positive way the binary dynamic, you and it, very close, very immediate, and very visceral. So here's some installation shots of the exhibition. And the whole idea of the late Western Imperium is, what would this fictitious culture, what would their visual culture ostensibly look like, and what issues would they address, and what imagery might it produce? So here's just a quick overview. I did 3 of these large flying carpets, and these, I don't know, they're maybe 30 feet. Isha, you're going to have to be my memory. I don't have any archival memory of my work in that sense. I'm just always living in the near future, and the future pluperfect. But I think they're 30 feet by 9 feet, or?
Yeah, they're 9 feet tall,
Yeah.
35 feet long.
So this is one of them, and this is Flying Carpet with Petri Dishes for a Disturbed Nation, 2013. And one of the things that I've always, I'm interested in observation. I'm a bit of a voyeur of looking at the state of human nature as it relates to the culture it makes, its behavior, and so forth, but then also historically conflating it with a big part of my education. I went to graduate school in the mid-'70s, I grew up in an art school that was amazing. I became a feminist at a very early age. I came out of the closet at age 20. And which, if you think about in 73, that wasn't always the easiest thing to do, not like now, all about assimilation. And also my teachers, Elizabeth Murray, Via Selmans, and Miriam Shapiro, were great lovers of the applied arts, of the decorative arts. And my art history teacher, Arlene Raven, a great art historian, but a Marxist, a revisionist art historian. It wasn't that we were trying to dismantle the beauty and the strengths of the modernist timeline. It wasn't about that, but about looking what had not been included. So that type of deconstructive lens of art history was already taking place at CalArts, which was really the first art school in America doing that. So I learned about the applied arts, about interior decoration, wallpaper, textile, everything. So it was a grand history. And lo and behold, when you look at those cracks, you also found that that's where women usually resided. So this is the second flying carpet with a waning moon over a violent nation. I'm always a little anxious to bring this up because I don't like, if there's a practice that gets unnecessarily essentialized in its relationship to the artist it's painting, I'm slightly allergic to that over-essentialization of the relationship between the maker of the object and the object being made, that you can't assume that the object being made isn't as well fictive. It isn't just telling the truth. But in this case, I think something that has stayed with me a very long time is I am that statistic of American gun violence. It was almost 30 years ago, and I'm really lucky to be standing here. So I think the whole idea of aesthetics, violence, internalized violence, I think as a culture we've reached a point of empathy fatigue, which is now a quantifiable psychological term, where it's impossible. I think we've internalized high degrees of violence, whether you actually circle around it or not. It doesn't really matter, even if you are not a statistic like I am, but we all have to do that. Just turning on the news, you really are internalizing high dosages. So I think there's empathy fatigue at a certain point, a type of agitans paralysis or something, So this is Flying Carpet with Magic Mirrors for a Distorted Nation. And actually I was very happy because it was up at MoMA on the 5th floor for quite a while. And it was great to have that viewership there. This is New National Anthem. So this idea of, again, that this fictitious late Western imperium, which is unnameable and unnamed, would create their own national anthem or make these paintings or these flying carpets. So this is New National Anthem and Lamentation Duet with Birds, and it's after Puccini. And this is one of my favorite arias, which is the first line, Visi d'arte, visi d'amore. I live for life and I live for art, live for love. Thank you. This new national anthem is, again, conjectural, a bit absurdist, but still full of hopefulness and lamentation, kind of the idea of duality. But that's at the core of Italian opera, which I love, is the duality of hopefulness and lamentation, the kind of bittersweet nature. And I think that that's also a temperature that my work has always had, is the cultivation of the bittersweet. My maternal family is South American, and my childhood language is Spanish. And I think that many times it's actually less culture that produces imagery, but language produces imagery more than, I think sometimes the whole idea that culture is the main engine that drives visual culture. I would say more specifically it's language. There was a historian who I spoke with. He said, Larry, you have to understand that a lot of the temperamentalities or visual accelerations or that occur in the work are not, you could address it to this kind of biculturalism, but that's unfortunately a form of re-essentialization of cultural identity, which I'm against. But really more out of language. So for example, when I speak in Spanish, I use my hands immediately. And Spanish allows for more, generally, Romance languages allow for daily use of higher degrees of poetic language without it seeming arch or suspicious. In English, it would seem odd. You'd take pause. And also, if you speak French, Italian, the Romance languages, your sense of time is also different. You use the future pluperfect, the conditional tense, the past tense, the subjunctive past tense, and so forth, which in English we stick pretty much to present, past, and future, you know. So that changes your relationship to how imagery is developed. This is 12 Fayum from a late Western Imperium, and that's after Hermenegildo Bustos, who's a great painter, kind of a self-taught painter from Mexico that I love from the 19th century. So that's works on paper. Set arrangements of ballet mécanique for a fossilized nation after Léger, and Léger did this wonderful kind of constructivist early film called Ballet Mécanique. So I think that it's impossible to make art without knowing about art. And it's impossible to make paintings without knowing the history of paintings. This one actually I have up in my dining room. I kept this for myself. And these are 12 reliquaries of souls trapped in amber from a late Western Imperium. So normally, things that are trapped in amber that we know of are insects. And I like the kind of the leap of logic that is being proposed here, that the kind of elusive understanding of something so dematerialized as a soul would be physically trapped in amber. These are aerial night views of secured districts of a late Western Imperium. I have to admit, this is such a rough title, but here it is. 12 pavilions designed for viewing First World atrocities. So get over it. But there's also, I think that one of the things I love is I love exaggeration, hyperbole, the fictive, and I think that I learned that actually from Western European religious painting. That actually one of the things that the grand history of Western European painting does so beautifully is that it advances a fictive narrative and does it in such a convincing way. but it is making a case for something that has been fundamentally unverifiable. And I think that that is the kind of conceptual apparatus. I'm not a religious person and I'm not a spiritual person, but I studied that conceptual apparatus of religious painting that has done so well. So I love the hyperbole that comes out of that history, the kind of advancement of a fictive narrative logic, and that's something that has been very central to the work as well. This is a needlepoint sampler with patches depicting daily life of a late Western imperium. But in reality, the more correct title is Needlepoint Sampler with Antidepressants. And I know it sounds glib, but I'm not being glib at the same time. It's not being glib. And so the pavilion, I have to step back also as a viewer of my own work, not just the maker, and I realize that some of the titles are hyperbolic and can maybe induce a bit of suspicion in the viewer. Needlepoint sampler with patches, another one. And so just to give you an idea, I'm sure you can read it, it's 108 by 90. This is a show that I did at Barbara Gladstone, Nuevos Capricciosos. I've always loved Goya. And I always love, I know this is almost oxymoronic and a bit insulting, but the gorgeousness of violence in the work. And especially the Capricciosos, which were his set of etchings dealing about how expert as human beings we are to mistreat each other. And then another hero of mine is Emily Dickinson, who is, I think, still a very underappreciated poet. I have great fondness for her. I particularly love her brutal poems about death and violence. I think she was a proto-feminist. It seems that she might have been a lesbian, highly educated, highly privileged, went to college, was an atheist, and I think that those were all incredible objectified lenses through which she wrote her poetry. So I thought, what would a painting like if I introduced them together? So the paintings bring together Emily Dickinson and the first kind of stanza of her poem where she hits you over the head with some just kind of philosophical awfulness from her perch in Massachusetts. Yeah, so I think there were 12 of them. So this is Capriccio. So, they're brutal in a way, but I love the kind of conflation of Goya and Emily Dickinson. I think we think of Emily Dickinson more in relationship to her poems about love and her relationship to an essentialized idea of nature. But here, for example, the main sentence is, pain has an element of blank it cannot recollect, which is very true. Another one. There is a pain so utter it swallows substance up. It almost sounds, if you think about it, that she's suggesting that something can be so overwhelming it can consume physical matter. That's it's a high level of conceptual abstraction already that's being advanced in that first line. And I thought I would build that around the idea of that and the history of the Capriccio. Pain has but one acquaintance, and that is death. And here a mother is with her apron. So these are the strings of her apron, and the mother is dangling her daughter upside down. But you know what? Always beautifully painted. No, and the reason I say that is that I think that I'm interested in the abject, but I'm not interested in the aesthetics of abjectness. And I think that is, actually two filmmakers, I think that Quentin Tarantino deals with violence in a very unusual way, as well as Pedro Almodovar, who is absolutely one of my favorite movie directors. And I think in sensibility, I'm the closest to Pedro Almodovar, in the sense that I think sometimes an understanding of the abject is through the least expected means, through, let's say, aesthetics, a decoration, and a type of even formalism. After great pain, a formal feeling comes. What? I mean, it's such a great, it's such a provocation. And that poem was probably 1862, already thinking, the idea of physical matter, dematerialization, and abstraction already deeply embedded in language. I better go a little faster. Wasn't somebody going to give me a reminder of time? Because I don't like when it goes on. And neither do you. Okay. I love this one. Absence disembodies, and so does death. This is actually one of the few poems that she wrote during the Civil War, about soldiers. This is a show I did at the Huntington. Again, I once in a while make a physical object. I love sculpture. I love someone like Rachel Harrison or Manfred Pernice or Isa Gensken, that kind of crazy materiality. And I envy that in other artists. I just don't have it in me. I'm a picture maker. And so I thought, how do I make a thing? And so I decided to make these big books. And I had visited, I've always loved illuminated manuscripts. I love the idea of the book being one of a kind, and that it's a structure for contemplation. But how do I make a secular prayer book? How do I make that you would still induce a certain reverie through images, but that it doesn't necessarily lead to spiritual enlightenment, but that is a vehicle in the same way for a contemplation on secularism. So these are the 10, I don't have them all. Sean helped me edit them out. I had too many. So just to give you the 10 titles, the 6 titles of the books are 10 Divinations by Emily Dickinson in Greens and Blues, 9 Apparitions during times of anxiety and distress, over 6 nights and 6 days, 12 verified occurrences during a full moon, 12 tableaux in which the avant-garde and the folkloric kissed, and 10 newly discovered constellations. So those are the titles. I've collaborated on many levels with the architect Michael Molson in Los Angeles, and he designed the exhibition for me at the Huntington Library. So the books are quite large. They weigh, maybe 60, 80 pounds each. And they're not a multiple. They are with tipped-in plates done in acrylic on paper. This one is 9 apparitions during times of anxiety and distress. And I was doing just, I wanted to know, I'm always interested in religious apparitions, again, through a secular lens. And it seems that the Virgin Mary has made appearances that have been documented on several occasions. But in looking, so I was looking up when has the Virgin Mary made these apparitions, and I was amazingly aware that it is during times of anxiety and distress. And I'll go through it. And it could be like if you think of, let's say the great play, The Crucible, where there's mass hysteria in Massachusetts, and all these young women start seeing, what is it, the devil? You know, the whole idea that maybe it could be an issue of internalized anxiety or mass hysteria that actually might be manufacturing or building these apparitions somehow that maybe even become visually manifest. I don't know. That I don't know. So this is Cuapa, Nicaragua, and it was been chronicled that the Virgin made an apparition right before the Sandinista Civil War. So that's the Virgin Mary there. Fatima, which of course is, and if you look at the date, that is right before the beginning of World War I. And that's one of the most famous apparitions of the Virgin. Akita, Japan, this is an interesting one. I think this one's, could be more linked to mass hysteria, and it was a whole convent who simultaneously developed the stigmata, which is the bleeding hands. But then recently there was a case somewhere in the eastern seaboard where 12 young girls who were on some sort of drill team woke up paralyzed for half a day. And they still don't know why these things happen, but these occurrences still happen. Zaytun, Egypt, actually there's a film online of these lights floating around the Christian cathedral in Zaytun, which they can't seem to explain. But this was also on the eve of the upheaval, several upheavals that have happened in Egypt at the time. Guadalupe Tepeyac, so the kind of internalized anxiety might have provoked the appearance of the Virgin of Guadalupe. I don't know. Again, I love a conjectural way of thinking and of thinking, well, what would that conjecture produce? So 1531 is at the beginnings of a long colonial period. And these are all acrylic on paper. Lavang, Vietnam, 1798. The very, very beginnings of colonial structures from France, especially. She made up an apparition there, and there was a large Catholic population that had been developed and nurtured in Vietnam. Medjugorje Sarajevo. This is a very well documented apparition. I guess the Vatican is having a problem with it, but this was on the eve of the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina, in the Serbian War. And there was an apparition there, and it's become a big pilgrimage site. This one, of course, Rwanda, another very well documented moment, Lourdes. This is kind of the reshaping of Europe in the late 19th century. And then I thought, well, any in America? So all these books had a bit of a punchline like that. So This is a sweet one. I love this one. This one I kept for myself. And it's just simply a fairy tale of a little boy who goes on a bicycle ride. So this is a very sweet one. These are his parents. And they say, good night, goodbye, first night. And on the second day, a young boy took off on his bike. And there he is on his bicycle with his egg and his lunch. This is a very sweet one. An encampment on the third night. So I'll go through these a little bit faster. These are friends along the way. On the sixth day, he meets a couple of birds who have laid eggs. Seventh night, he meets a marsupial. And so the books are very large, and I wanted them to be experiential in a way that a good picture book can be. But then that, I think even though they're produce narrativity, there's still high degrees of leaps of logic that you have to take as you're going through each book. Eighth night, he decides to play. Ninth night, bless you. 10th day, he meets a fire-breathing dragon who's laid 2 eggs as well. 11th night, he meets a woman who has a real arm, a prosthetic arm, 2 real legs, and a prosthetic leg. And so the other thing is that the books change in temperamentality. So the palette also, the kind of, this kind of mutability of experience. So the book goes from day to night, day to night. And if you are looking at the book, eventually you would deduce that, that's happening. And the 12th day, he falls off his bicycle and lands on his head. And then the book ends like this. So it's a two newly discovered constellations. I'll go through these. I think the whole idea of location, like where the kind of, I like to induce a certain experience of the world. So what would it be to locate this narrative in the cosmos, for example? Like the idea of where the narrative takes place. So for example, the last book, it's actually a physical ride about on your bicycle. But here, what would it be? How would imagery and narrative locate itself within the incomprehensibility of the cosmos? And again, going back to that idea of the abstraction of that poem by Emily Dickinson, I'm actually showing you hypermaterialization within something that, an idea which remains, for most of us, incomprehensible. What's terrifying is just this idea of the event horizon, for example, that we're now being asked to contemplate in terms of the black hole. This is a show I did in Berlin. Grisaille Ethics Knots, Paintings with Cataplasms. And this was a very difficult show for me because I absolutely love color, and I guess it comes from a long history. I think that one of the problems I think that painters face is the problem of redundancy and visual redundancy. So I've always made it a point to list the things that I can't do in the next body of work. as a way of trying to keep the work rigorous for me and hopefully for the viewer. In this, I decided that I would keep it to grisaille, a palette of gray, blacks, and whites, a grayscale. And a cataplasm is really a poultice. And so this painting actually sports its own poultice because it's as if the painting, the object itself, is having some sort of, I don't know, intrinsic problem that needs the painting itself, the physical object of the painting itself, needs a poultice attached to its surface to somehow remedy it as well. Some installation shots. So this was for me, it was a difficult painting to think in this palette. But what I loved was that it almost felt like photograms, that somehow the whole idea of investigating the whole idea of maladies and treatments simultaneously within the painting, that the painting advances the notion visually of a malady, and then the cataplasm is the actual treatment that's being applied to the surface of the painting. So these are very, very thick layers of oil paint. So those are the cataplasms that overlay the painting and are areas that we can't see but are being treated. Some works on paper. These are maybe, I'm 5'4", so these are maybe 5 feet, something like that. But I was very excited and happy there was a point where I gave into it, and because actually, as a structuralist and really ultimately a formalist painter, you use color to create the dynamics of the event that you're trying to portray. Even though to this day, an old friend of mine who passed away, a great sculptor, Robert Overby, taught me when I was really young, always take black and whites when you're working of the painting. So I do that to this day with my phone to see how value structure is being kind of dynamics, like in music, you know. The value structure are the visual dynamics of a painting, to see how they're playing out. And a quick way to do that is to take a black and white to see how that's playing out structurally. But then what is it to actually start making it as such and not just photographing it, it was difficult for me. Here's one. So these are 96 by 86, and so these are the poultices on the painting. And it almost functions like if you look at like early surrealist photography, the use of the negative in analog printing as the main document for the photograph. But in this, the way the paintings were constructed, that it almost creates a rayogram or an X-ray of the malady itself, or an MRI of the malady. So this imagery comes out of, I love watching television. I love junk television a lot. There was I think a commercial about test dummies for a Volvo commercial. And so this comes out of that, just to give you a little bit of a background story. And some of these will be in, actually a lot from, someone was asking me, I think Anne, you asked me, whether they're going to be, some of these will be in the exhibition. Actually, quite a bit of this work will be in the later phases of the retrospective. And this is, I did a show with my very, very good friend, Silke Otto-Knopp, who's also my colleague at UCLA. And we decided to do a project together. I really won't be speaking about her work. I adore her work because she's not here and I don't feel comfortable speaking on behalf of her work. So I'll show you. So this is, again, another kind of conjectural leap of logic project where I decided that I would make more of these books. I enjoyed making them so much. And I worked with a great bookbinder and who was able to actually physically make the books. They're quite large and heavy, and she was able to devise a beautiful hinge system so that the books wouldn't crack and they would lay flat as you kept opening them. And so this is a 10-volume series of books. And again, I collaborated with the architect Michael Molson, and Lorraine Wild, who is a designer who I've worked with for many years doing catalogs, and the bookbinder. So it was a way of, so it's a difficult thing to show books because you really can't allow the viewer to page through them. So I came to the gallery every Saturday to page through the books and greet people, and I enjoyed it. It was unusually social for me. When I have an exhibition, I actually don't return to it. I try not to return to it until the very end, because I think the last thing a dealer wants is the artist hanging around, you know. So I try to absent myself. I've done my work, and now it's on its own. It's up. It's got to somehow fly or not fly. So these were built around a certain subject matter, the idea of human nature, and also palette, how the palettes move from page to page. So here's a History of Human Nature, Volume 1, and I'll go through. So really, I mean, it's a very simple suggestion and prompt, really. It's just it's not that the text it's a kind of maybe more mutualism that's happening between the text and the image, that they're there to fundamentally introduce themselves to each other, but the visual component is not an illustration of the text, or vice versa, the text is not subservient to the image, although there is a connection. And as with all of my work, the titles usually are something I develop very, very early on. The work is not titled after the work is made. The title actually comes when I work at the desk, and I kind of decide on the kind of meta structure of the body of work, and usually the titles are developed at that time. So I had the titles all on the wall. This is a completely nocturnal book. And that was a kind of atmospheric conditions. I think that's always the kind of psychological, emotional, and atmospheric conditions of the experience that I want to hopefully induce in the viewer. They're always very much grounding the decisions of the making of the work. So this house is very anxious, but it has no understanding or idea or reality that something is growing underneath its foundation. This is not as accurate a depiction. This book actually goes from that very abstracted moment to a very kind of more recognizably narrative moment. We just had to, okay, thank you. I've got to end it. Are we at an hour? Okay. I'll just go through these. And then I'll just quickly show you a last body of work. This was last year, portraits of textiles and portraits of humans. And I guess this goes again back to my early education, kind of revisionist art history, where, you know, we look at the fine arts many times as the kind of penultimate indicator or residue or portrait of a society or of a culture, you know, when we study Greek antiquities or Roman, so the fine arts. But I'm trying to make a case that the applied arts and the decorative arts give as trenchant a social portrait of a culture and of a civilization. So that's why I wanted to create an equivalency between the portraiting of a textile and a portraiting of a human. This was, the structure was set up very early on where a portrait of a human and a portrait of a textile would be having a kind of symbiotic conversation with each other, and then the actual type of fabric and the imagery would coincide, would somehow indicate, you know, like for example, this was an idea, there are I don't know, this flounder or that if it's on, they're fish that if they lay flat for the longest time absorb the pattern of, I don't know, of what's underneath them. So there's a famous picture of a flounder on top of a plaid, and slowly the plaid starts appearing in the flounder itself. And I love that kind of almost brutal equivalency. It's brutal if you think about it, brutal in a conceptual way. So that's kind of got me started on this body of work. Here's installations. So this is portrait of a human, and the humans are pathos, ethos, logos, and kairos, which are the arguments for action, reason, ideas. And then the portrait of the textile is crushed linen velvet. Again, a portrait of a human and a portrait of a textile, brocade. This is a damask with its accompanying human. You know, in some the connections are maybe more retrievable visually, quickly, and then some take a little bit longer to kind of prod out what their relationship is that it's occurring. Portrait of a textile, it's a bias cut tattersall, and portrait of a human. I think also my love of textiles comes from a long period, a period of my early in my 20s, where I loved it. When I left CalArts, I had no desire to teach. I just did not feel I had a voice to be in front of a classroom in any level. So I decided to get a job in the interior design world. And I worked for kind of one of America's first, what you would call branded superstar decorators, as they were called then. There was not the aspirational nomenclature of designer, and that was Angelo Donghia. And I worked for him for quite a while, and he said, Larry, you can always work for me, but this is not your world. You have to, so I enjoyed working there. I learned about human nature. I learned about money. I learned about textiles. So, this is kind of this, again, circling back around to one's personal narrative, which I'm sure you've heard from a lot of the visiting artists, how the personal narrative does, of course, impact the production and the practice. It's just that I try to somewhat sublimate that a bit in the discussion of the art. Portrait of a textile block printed linen with its accompanying human. Portrait of a textile, glazed chintz. Portrait of a textile, a reversible jacquard. Portrait of a textile, silk organza. Portrait of a textile, Art Deco toile de Jouy. I really like toile de Jouy because it's usually a one-color block print on a very light batiste cotton. And toile de Jouy is, it's a kind of a problematic textile now because it usually revolved around the depiction of colonialist history. And actually one of the first artists to ever use it was in the 90s, which is the great interdisciplinary artist Renee Green, who did an installation using toile de Jouy. So usually it's very folkloric. It's showing, I guess these fictitious African cultures or Latino cultures or pre-Columbian cultures in this kind of Frenchified vignette. So I decided to kind of create a new toile de Jouy. Cotton eyelet with embroidery. I mean, it's not cotton and there's no embroidery, by the way. So, anyway, that's it. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions?
How long does it take you to do a book, one book?
I don't know because I don't work unilaterally, I work multilaterally. So everything is occurring at once. I work on everything simultaneously.
But it's only a series at a time.
Yes, a series at a time. So I don't know exactly how long it takes, but let's say those books, the set of 10 books on human nature, I think I worked on for maybe 8 months, something like that.
Thank you very much. I'm just curious. Sure. You began by saying that you're analog, not digital.
Uh-huh.
But there's a certain digital sensibility in some of the work, some of the layering effects.
Yeah.
Care to comment?
Well, I think that, for example, it's only not digital in its performative nature. It's only digital in its making, or digital, or analog. I'm sorry. In other words, when I say analog and digital, those are two parallel experiential ideas of space and time. For when I say analog, it's just simply talking about me physically making the work. Although we've now come to understand through Photoshop or all sorts of things that things can mutate and look like they were analog experiences, but in reality were digitally constructed and vice versa. So I think that it just simply talks about me making them in an analog way. But I've internalized absolutely how we process imagery and understand imagery digitally, of course. Laura?
I can scream.
Oh, okay.
You know, one of the things I've always loved so much about your work is this really brilliant way of using color. And I'm interested to know, did you have a mentor, or was this something that just really emerged out of you?
Well, I'll always remember on my graduate committee at CalArts, I had two kind of people that did not like each other, and that was John Baldessari and Miriam Shapiro. And at one time, and I remember in my graduate, I was 23 or 24 years old, and Mimi in her Long Island accent, a very thick Long Island accent, says, "Larry, I taught you all about color," you know. And I think she did. I think it comes from, she was a great colorist, and she was not color phobic in that sense. I think, there was a sort of I liked the promiscuity by which she used colors. But I also like the social signification of colors. Like one of my favorite quotes is by Diana Vreeland, who once said, "Pink is the navy blue of India." And I think that shows how color, the idea of color is mutable, and or like, for example, the phenomena periodically that it appears in the newspaper where someone has disrupted the color protocol sense of a neighborhood by painting their house lavender, and how disruptive culturally color can be that way within a context. So I learned the kind of promiscuity of color from Miriam Shapiro very strongly, and then the kind of social signification of color when I worked with Angelo Donghia, because I would hear constantly the gendering of colors, and I was really taken aback by how entrenched that is culturally, or colors where, I remember the mantra, where there's taupe, there is hope. But I would turn it around and I say, where there's taupe, there is no hope. So, I think, I love color in all those ways, Laura. It's really kind of dismantling the significations, but reassembling them in different ways, So I always go back to those things, and, Anybody else?
Address the scale of the portraits in the series that we just saw, where the textiles were so much larger and wider than that.
If I was going to show a portrait of the textile, I had to show a repeat. I think it came down to just that. They all show a basic full drop repeat. It's a kind of classic repeat of textiles. Actually, going back really quickly, Laura, I think that I also learned a lot of colors from one of two artists who are my favorite artists, and that's Sonia Delaunay, and who we would now call an interdisciplinary artist. But the nomenclature wasn't there in the early 20th century when she was working. Or Natalia Goncharova, who I think was also a really great artist. But going back to your question, so that was about just showing the full drop repeat. and that the human being had been, I guess, had been so self-fetishized and so you know, I mean, as much as I embrace the culture of individuation, I think that hyper-individuation is also problematic because it starts diluting at the idea of commonality. So that the patterning, if you looked at was very concentrated on the way the humans are decorated or self-decorated, you know. But the big ones did show a repeat. Another question back there.
I was just wondering, as you have a 40-year retrospective coming up, I wonder what the promise is for the future, or if it helps shape your new work, or what direction you think your new work might take you in.
Well, I'm very disciplined, and I'm also very lopsided, and I love being in my studio. So I'm currently working on a show for Lehman Mopin Gallery in New York that'll be in March, at the beginning of March. So even though I'm involved in the retrospective and kind of forensically going backwards, I still have to simultaneously project into the future with this new body of work, which I'm making now. So I'm trying actually to change the palette of the work. It's a very kind of a subdued, very moodish palette, as opposed to this kind of bright optical palette of high contrast.
Thank you.
Is that it? Well, thank you very much.